will be focusing on the impact of Hong Kong on China in the early 20th century all the way to the end of the Second World War when Japan surrendered. So I admit that it's a long time. It covers close to 50 years. But yet, the in the past, according to past experience, students are more interested in learning about the more recent history of Hong Kong, especially after the war. And there's a lot to cover, the changes, the rise of Hong Kong, Cantopop, and then the return of Hong Kong, first the negotiation, discussion, and then the actual return and the changes and the recent protests, 2014, 2019. So we do have a lot to cover. So as a result, I need to speed this part up. But I'm going to focus on some of the you can say the main points of the roles of Hong Kong, especially as a British colony, but how it got closely related to China. I think that's really the key and the emphasis that we should focus on, because that is a interesting thing. Because on one hand, Hong Kong was governed by the British government, was a colony, but on the other, it is well, it was it has been, put it this way, part like in the mainland of China, because it's not like and on another island like Taiwan is part of China, is considered to be part of China for the longest time. So, but since it was kind of part of China, but yet not quite, I think that is a major theme that has defined Hong Kong for a long time. Even today, you can kind of say it's like a pendulum. On sometimes Hong Kong feels like it's really foreign to China. But sometimes, for example, now they seems to be closer because it has been returned to China, and obviously China has been increasing its kind of influence over Hong Kong in the recent, say, decade. But it's still Hong Kong is not quite China. Put it this way, it's part of China, but not quite China. And in the early 20th century, it wasn't much like part of China because of its colony status. But I do have to use a person to kind of highlight this interesting, you can say, position of Hong Kong. For example, Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, of course, was the kind of leader of revolution activities in China that led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. Now, Sun Yat-sen was you can say, international, transnational, because he had been living in different places and he operated like a transnational. What does it mean? He was born in China, but he went to live with his brother, Sun Mei, at a very young age. Now, his brother went to Honolulu to work and was part of the Cantonese migration that happened in starting in mid and the late 19th century. We have not covered that because it's not part of this course, but it's something that I would talk about when I teach like a Chinese overseas or migration history. But lots of Chinese would go over to America, to South America. Many of them sent over there as coolies to Peru, and then also Cuba. But then many also went over to America in mid 19th century, for example, San Francisco, including Vancouver, Victoria, and some went to Honolulu, and with Hawaii being very welcoming to you can say foreign workers, because it was often there's a transient characteristics of Hawaii. But anyway, he went there so he got to see the world, you can say, at a very young age. Then he went back to China and he was interested in education. And maybe because of that eye-opening and also because of opportunity allowed, he went to Hong Kong to attend schools. He went to the famous DBS, and then the Queen's College, which Ryan last class mentioned. It was a government-run school that really trying to produce the next generation of, you can say, elites in the colony. And so he was one of the elites. And then later, after graduation, he enrolled in the Hong Kong College of Medicine for Chinese, which I also briefly mentioned that he eventually would become the Hong Kong University. And during that time, he was greatly influenced by his teacher and mentor. Also, someone mentioned by Ryan in his guest video, Hawkeye, and he was actually very famous not only as a mentor of Sun Yat-sen, but he was a philanthropist. He was also a very successful businessman, and he sponsored or he donated money to build the first airport in Hong Kong, which was named after him and another donor, Kai Tak. So Kai Tak Airport was named partly after Hawkeye, who was a teacher and a mentor of Sun Yat-sen, and Hawkeye being you can say, second generation Chinese Christian in Hong Kong. His father was the second ordained pastor, second Chinese ordained pastor, Protestant pastor in China. And he was able to not only make a lot of money, being very successful, but he also had a lot of foreign, you can say, ideas, and he saw that the uh, other nations are getting really powerful. China was falling behind, so he was very unhappy about what the Manchus were doing to China. So he passed those ideas to the young Sun Yat-sen and talking about exposing, criticizing the corruption, the inefficiency, the oppression of China's gentry-dominated ruling bureaucracy, the Confucian thoughts, the out of date, and also the very stagnant kind of ideas. So as a result, Sun Yat-sen had this revolutionary ideas since a very young age, and he was among those who believed that China could only recover if the Qing dynasty was gone. So unlike some other, for example, Hong Yau-wen, who would be like the conservative reformers who really want to help the Qing government to modernize or to help the Qing government continue. Sun Yat-sen was more the revolutionary, feeling that there's no point to hope that the Qing government would ever do enough to turn China around. So the Manchus, this Confucian, very conservative and very backward thinking leadership governing must go. So that's why he was there to he was very much influenced by them. Sorry, I had to step out of the room briefly just now. But he faced a big problem because he was more you can say, promoter or activist, but he didn't have any military background or relationship, so he had no like armies and no one fighting for him. So he was more like a promoter. He would he would write about it. So Hong Kong became a very important base for him. Now, even though he started his China Revival Society to engage in revolutionary activities in Honolulu, back to the place where his brother was, and for good reason, because his brother was doing quite well. So he was like the first financial backer of his revolutionary ideas. And then, but later soon, he moved the operation to Hong Kong because he realized the you can say, important role can be played by Hong Kong. Hong Kong was uh, like right next to mainland China, put this way, where it's basically together. So there's a very close proximity, but because it was a British colony, that means that you can engage in revolutionary activities, publish things, you can talk, and you can work on ideas, you can promote, you can raise fund without being actually endangered by Chinese. There was evidence and all this evidence that Chinese agents, you can say Chinese government agents, were working in these areas, always trying to arrest him or endanger him. Because one time he was in London, he was actually captured by and kidnapped by the um, Chinese agents and operating in the the UK capital. And it's kind of like a movie. He went to the washroom and then he was able to throw out some of the pieces of papers, writing uh, some rescue me like wording, and he was picked up. And also people noticed that he was missing, and the of course, because he was in the UK and the Chinese agents did not want to do anything. They were trying to kidnap him, send him back to China to go on trial, but they did not kill him right away, and he was discovered and he was released. He was rescued. But so we know that Chinese was trying to get at him. But in Hong Kong, he was safe enough because the British government would not allow, a very obvious operation of Chinese secret agents. And so Hong Kong became his base. And when he would not only would publish things, but he was also raise fund, and the money would be sent to Hong Kong. And we have plenty of evidence. This one is the one written by himself, talking about he received $1,000 from the 四大都会馆, which was a big 会馆 in Honolulu, and it was one of the major 香山 会馆. So it was the hometown 会馆. So I will explain. The 会馆 was a kind of like a synagogue for the Jews. So it was a local building that usually identified by the Chinese people group with the same language group. For example, you have the Hakka Uyghur, you have the Cantonese Uyghur, you have the Teochew Uyghur. So what happened is that when these people went to overseas to work, especially in the beginning to Southeast Asia, they would like staying together. They would help one another. They would organize events together because they will be, for example, have a similar worship of Maju or Tinhao, and they would have performances during New Year or some kind of celebration, and they would hire performers to perform. For example, if it's Teochew in Bangkok, they would invite the Teochew opera troops to go there and perform, and they would have some kind of like entertainment, time that spending together. They would serve as the post office. For example, there's some things mail from China to this place, for example, in Penang, in Malaysia, and they would distribute the stuff. Or if they have news they want to get back home, they would go to those places and try to spread the news. For example, this worker want to find a wife, and he didn't want to find a wife in Southeast Asia. He would want to go back, send words over that he's going back home next month, and hopefully they can hook him up with some lady who want to marry him and move overseas. So it operates kind of like a local community, but within a language group. And so for his hometown, the Sansan's hometown, which is Shansan, a lot of the early migrants were from those areas, and they went to Honolulu, and they have this huge uh, 会馆. So he was there, and um, they would donate money for him, and they would ask him to send the money back to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong would be close enough for the money to be usable without being confiscated by China. So they can't send it to like Guangzhou or some other places, because the money would be taken by the Chinese government. But the money would be sent to Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong they could buy, for example, arms. Arms were shipped to Hong Kong from Europe, from other places, and they would purchase the arms and then smuggle into China. Now, eventually, that's the way Sun Yat-sen wanted to start the revolution, is that he would ship arms, he would ship uh, guns to China and asked them to rebel, for example, especially down in the south, because they knew that the Qing government was relying really on regional governments or governors to protect them. For example, if a regional governor or a official refused to crack down on the rebellion, that means that that county or that city or that even as big as a province would be kind of independent because they will be under in the hands of the revolutionaries. And in that case, the empire will break up because the central government just could not manage that many different rebellions happening. So that was the plan, and that's how they moved around, and eventually they were successful. And nowadays, if you go to Honolulu, you can still see statues of Sun Yat-sen because Sun Yat-sen would be considered like a local son because even though he didn't spend a lot of time there, but he was well connected, and because the lot of migrants came from the same area, and so they supported him. So they highly regard him, and also because they felt proud that this boy from our town, eventually he was successful in overthrowing the Qing dynasty. So they were very proud of him. And some of the places where Sun Yat-sen asked for money, including Vancouver. Now, this is a letter we found. I personally involved in it, not not old enough to involve in the actual activities, but I involved in translating this letter because it was discovered and they looking for a translator, and I help them with it because of my license, but also with my history background. So it was one of the lobbying letters he drafted and sent from Vancouver. When he briefly stayed in Vancouver, he was in Vancouver for 3 times, and he wrote about when he received money, and then he talked about sending the money and hoping the money could be sent to Hong Kong on behalf. And so it's pretty much the operation that I was doing. Going from places to places, raising funds, and then have the money sent back to Hong Kong so that they can purchase military equipment, um, guns for the revolutionary, and help instigate, let's say, revolutions in South China. And if you go to the Chinatown Storytelling Center, which is, of course, in Chinatown, Vancouver, it's a small museum, but you can see one of the IOU as well, just like the one I showed you earlier. That one is a IOU wrote by Sun Yat-sen to the Freemason here in Vancouver. So he was asking them to lend him, lend him money so that he could help fund the activities of revolutionaries. And they at that time they didn't have that much money. The people in Vancouver, the Chinese here, but they had their properties, so they remortgaged their properties and gave him the money. And eventually he did use the money and eventually he was successful, but he never paid back. Probably not entirely his fault. It's not that he made a lot of money, because by the time he basically died, the country was still kind of in pieces because after the Qing government fell, many of the regional, you can say, governors or the warlords now the Qing fell because they stopped offering help to the empire. But when they stopped offering help, didn't mean that they would join with the revolutionaries in the south. They basically became warlords and occupied parts of China. So he took his protege Chiang Kai-shek to eventually unify China after a northern exhibition, but it only concluded in late 1920s. So Sun Yat-sen already dead by then. So he was never quite completed. He never quite completed the revolutionary ideal he had. So he was able to topple the Qing government, but he wasn't able to see China unified as a one strong democratic nation that he had envisioned. But as mentioned, Hong Kong was used as a place for publication. He would publish posts like the China Daily, and eventually that, of course, they were because Hong Kong was so close. So many of these publications not only encouraged the people in Hong Kong to support revolutionaries, It also encouraged the people in China because sometimes they would bring the news back to China, and when they see it, they knew that there are people, and they felt a international support of their activities. Even though it's very dangerous to go against a dynasty, even though the dynasty is on this like dying leg, but it's still a empire that lasts for more than 200 years and used to be one, if not the most um, powerful countries in the world. So it was very dangerous. But knowing that there will be money coming in, knowing that Sensang will be effective in bringing in support from all over the world, gave them that, you can say, spiritual or emotional support that eventually they were successful. And so Sensang could be credited to that, even though eventually it gave rise to other ambition dictators, you can say, or warlords, including Yuan Shikai. But he was successful as a revolutionary, and Hong Kong played a big role. If not for that, Hong Kong's position of part of China, but not quite China, and you can do a lot to influence China, but you're not be inside China to be, to put yourself in danger, allow revolution in China to happen. So if not for Hong Kong, now I'm not saying that the Qing government would not fall without Hong Kong, but how long more? And where else could they en- engage in that much revolutionary activities is hard to tell. But Hong Kong definitely played a very important role in the toppling of the Qing government in 1919. Now, sorry, 1911. Now, what happened is that Hong Kong was also a very interesting port in which I think we kind of mentioned last time as well. Hong Kong's border was open. Hong Kong's border was not closed until 1951, as we'll see later, probably next time, probably not this today's class. But Hong Kong's border was open, so it encouraged people to go down to work in Hong Kong. For example, when Hong Kong had the big building projects, and they start calling for Hong people. And remember, Hong Kong was just a small fishing village. It was not like a already mid-sized city like Shanghai when it became a trading port. Hong Kong was a tiny fishing village, and hardly anyone there in terms of population. So it really depends on the transient population, with people coming in from places in Guangzhou and other places to go. That's why Hong Kong later became such a strong Cantonese speaking country, or state, or city state, whatever you call it, sorry. So depending on which level, colony, let's just call it colony, okay, for some time. Hong Kong became a very strongly Cantonese speaking colony, because of the number of people coming in from Guangzhou area, from that area that's would speak Cantonese. Of course, there are other people, for example, people coming in Hakka, from Hakka area, from the Teochew area, but because the majority of them will be coming from the Guangzhou area, the Cantonese speaking area, so the majority of people will be speaking Cantonese, even though some of them would have their own also local, you can say, dialects, and they will have their own local accents as well. Now, because of that, so that's part of the reason why the British were um, spending so much and going into such details in creating Hong Kong as such a wonderful place. As mentioned, Hong Kong has a very nice waterfront, as we will see in the video soon, and has got a tram and modern transportation systems to move people and goods around, and beautiful places, and the video will show you towards the end of today's class. You will see it. But it was really just to compete with other ports, and then later compete with Shanghai. And the competition is for both the investors, the merchants, the traders to come to use Hong Kong as a port, but also for workers. So as mentioned, they would eventually have the Chinese to help the local Chinese workers as well. So they became the elites to help them, whether to start a hospital or some kind of uh, s- social welfare organizations like the Volunteer to help disadvantaged or women that need help. Um, so it was a situation, but this transient population also posed a problem that if something bad happened in Hong Kong, people would just leave, especially the Chinese. So it would leave Hong Kong to become a dead port. And it was possible. And in the beginning, the biggest threat was some kind of plague. When disease broke out and people start dying, people got scared and they start, as long as China did not stop them from moving back, they would. And in the beginning, most of the people from Hong Kong, they didn't find Hong Kong as home. They only felt Hong Kong was like a place where they worked, and they would expect to return Hong Kong. They may not return Hong Kong all the time because there's, of course, back then, there's lots of transportation issues. It's not easy to go back and forth, but they would think eventually we're going to go back. So I'm going to stay in Hong Kong for the next 5 years or 10 years. I'm going to make enough money. Then I'm going to go back home to my, Guangzhou City or somewhere. So that's the idea. So many people didn't see themselves as Hong Konger. So about 2 weeks later or two classes later, we're going to talk about this idea of Hong Konger and where it came from. But in the beginning, they were Chinese. They just happened to be in Hong Kong. They're Chinese working in Hong Kong. They're Chinese who had a place to stay in Hong Kong, but they would always want to go back um, for when the holidays or when they uh, start working there, because most of the family is still in China. So that's the transient population. And the other things that would really push them to go back is when they was angry about certain um, arrangement or certain events, which is exactly happened in 1922 when the Chinese seamen from Hong Kong and joined a protest with Canton to demand for higher wages because um, they were uh, demand because they saw that they're not paying as well. So they were protesting about it. So there was a strike, and it was a uh, joint strike because they knew that if Hong Kong people left, okay, then they can paralyze the port very easily. So at that time, there's lots of discussion about whether it was the actual like trade demand or the workers' demand, or it was some, uh, you can say activists behind this. And usually the communists would be blamed for this type of activities. Now, it was one of the early strike, and this type of collaboration would not be seen often. And in the modern day, one of the collaboration between Canton and Hong Kong would be the Hong Kong Cantonese language protest, which we'll talk about in the future. But the bigger incident was the general strike boycott of 1925. Now, that one was bloody. It happened when Chinese protesters in the international settlement, which we'll see later in Shanghai, they were protesting, and something happened that the Sikh detachment fired on the Chinese protesters, killing 9, and then another massacre in Xiamen. The Xiamen is the place where the 13 factories. Remember back in the Canton system when the 13 factories they located on this man-made island called Xiamen, and so the workers they also protest against the foreigners who were trading in Canton. And so at that time, 50 more protesters were killed by British troops. Now, we can hardly go into details about what exactly happened usually. Most likely it was there some detachment. The Sikh detachments were a common sign uh, in British colonies and other ports because they would employ the Indian soldiers and oftentimes will be Sikh because they will be they look pretty foreign, okay, and quite formidably built, quite tall, and with the turban even taller, and they would the Chinese saw them, kind of scared of these foreign-looking people. And the British also could kind of hide them, at a kind of get lower cost, and to keep peace. Okay, of course they would reserve the many of the army roles for example, British or the Caucasian British, and so the armies have been lots of you can say Caucasian soldiers in the army, but in the police attachments, especially when they didn't have enough people, they will welcome other ethnic groups, including the Sikh, also the Uyghurs, which would be very effective for a long time in Hong Kong. But in Shanghai also they have Sikh detachments, and oftentimes, because a lot of people, you have to remember when people protest, a lot of Chinese there, okay, maybe thousands, okay, Chinese there, and one wrong move, okay, whether it was just a mistake or it's just an actual attempt or just a sudden, lose of faith, and just someone just heard some noise, and the detachments, of course, would be a lot smaller, maybe 10 or 20 armed people protecting a certain facilities. Some foreigners, when the protesters, which were a lot more numerous, make some moves or believed to be making some moves, sometimes they make mistakes and pull the trigger and people die. And that is quite often uh, happening because it's very seldom that a very small detachment would dare to fire on a huge um, group of people. Uh, of course, there's exception as well, but in this case, I believe it's at least I believe okay, it was probably it was probably not planned. Okay, it's not like they intended to, but it was like suddenly happened. But anyway, it triggered a big event. So what happened is that when the two incidents of killing massacres were reported, the Chinese from Hong Kong were furious. So 50,000 left. And by the end of July, which is within 2 months, 250,000 Chinese workers left. So that gives us a really good look at the situation in Hong Kong at that time. Not only did that many Chinese were leaving, but also Hong Kong was actually having that many people working already. So it's a huge population. And the boycott lasted for a year, and the British this time was in deep trouble, and they need a trading loan of £3 million to save the colony's economy. So at one point, they thought that maybe the colony is gone. And at that time, they remember, okay, we have been relying on the Hong Kong elites, okay, whether they're Eurasians or Chinese, maybe merchants or Chinese who were uh, they were kind of well known among the Chinese population. They could help, they could advise the government, or they could even represent the government to kind of lower the temperature. So that's what they did. They reached out and enlist of help of um, the Eurasians, Robert Caldwell and another famous Chinese leader at that time, Joseph Sun, as mentioned, is my uh, very remote uh, relative. I know her, well, I knew his only daughter, and she was a uh, live in Half Peak all her life, never work again. Also, very rich, and she had two uh, children whom I call auntie and uncle, I think. So yeah, so quite, we would go to her home, during New Year to wish her Happy New Year and collect red pockets, and so always had style, always live with style. And I remember maybe a couple decades ago, she published a book on her dad. I still have the book somewhere to talk about her father. And so it was a book that she get a publisher to publish about the life of her father, uh, Susan Zhou, which was one of the very wealthy compradors in Hong Kong. So they were the local elites. And so they advised the colonial government two things. They say you have to use both, okay? On one hand, you have to offer awards to returning workers. Okay, don't always push them. Okay, you can't push them. They can stay in China. If they could stay away for months and almost a year, they have means. Okay, so they may like to work in Hong Kong again. But if you are forcing them, if you are pushing them too much, they're just going to stay in China. So you have to give them some incentive. Uh, so, for example, pleasure resource encourage Chinese opera troops because at that time, by the time early 20th century, already very popular. These troops would perform at big theaters. So it's not just during for example, a religious festival where they would hire these performers. They would even hire them, regularly when the Chinese candidates would be drinking the tea, enjoying an afternoon, and while watching the performance of the actors and actresses. So, but it would be a carrot and stick. So on one hand, they give them incentive, encourage them to come back and give them maybe a bigger pay and allow them more pleasure. On the other, they would have routine military marches. So to show that they meant business, okay, to show that they were serious about keeping Hong Kong. So it's not like, okay, you guys all left. Hong Kong is dead, so the British will go away, so there will be end of it. So that to show the British meant business, they're not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And that similar carrot and stick will be used in 1967 during the Hong Kong riot, so which we're going to talk about. So the general strike boycott successfully paralyzed Hong Kong, and the economic losses were staggering. At the end, two sides decided they had colonial government pay an extra 2.5 surcharge to bring back the workers. So before the workers would come back, and of course the workers were more likely to come back because after all, it was not in Hong Kong, even though you can say that the people who did the killing was still the British, okay, or the British detachments, but still, it did not happen in Hong Kong. So eventually they were able to reach some compromise, and workers returned to Hong Kong. So but that general strike and boycott would eventually be often mentioned by future protesters, especially from the leftist camps. We used to be able to bring the British to the knees, okay, meaning that they were willing to compromise and pay them more, give us a surcharge. So we could do it again. So this is also what they were saying in 1967, which we have to come back again. So this is situation of Hong Kong. But overall, Hong Kong was a peaceful place where people would come and work, and many of the pictures showed an overwhelmingly Chinese city. Because yes, you have foreigners, but you need workers to keep it going, right? You need workers to keep the restaurants open, keep the port open, keep the transportation open. The residential poors must be there. The cooks must be there, the cleaners must be there. So overwhelmingly Chinese city, but you also have a lot of foreigners there living a good life. Wedding in St. George, one of the oldest churches in Hong Kong. If not the oldest, I think it's oldest actually. And the other ones are Americans at the Hong Kong Cricket Club. And an interesting thing is about Hong Kong is that Hong Kong playing tennis, at least when I remember back in my youthful days, okay. Now it's hard to say because there are more opportunities to play the sport of tennis, and many Hong Kongers, they learn, they play overseas and come back, right? But back in the early days, including all the way up to like 1970s and 80s, I think there's a sense that if you get to play tennis, you're usually better off, okay? Because you need the space, and it's not always easy to get a tennis court in Hong Kong. And back then, when I was young, the only place people would play tennis would be going to places like CRC, which is in Causeway Bay, the Chinese recreational club, or for example, the racing uh, 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 club. So the where they would have a club on the hillside where you would have tennis court. So I remember back then, uh, it was often the um, better off people that would go there. For example, I remember my uncle who was at that time a doctor, so he would spend money for a really large sum of, you can say, club membership, a yearly club membership, just to have the kind of a access to tennis court so that he and his family could play tennis there. And sometimes he would invite us, but wow, this is like a very club environment. So it's kind of started in Hong Kong back then because it's usually you need a big space to play tennis and you can't be on the land, right? You don't have many indoor facilities to play, and even in Hong Kong, you have lots of multi story building. And nowadays, for example, many of these buildings would be the government buildings, and they would have a market down in the bottom, and you can have, buy food and veggies, the market there. Then you have different levels and different government offices, and also they will have badminton courts. Okay, your courts or sometimes squash courts they play. So those sports will be more accessible to Hong Kong people. But tennis, at least for some time, was more a upper class sport, you can say. So not many people will be able to gain access to play those sports. And but the people also making money because Hong Kong is doing well, and the Eurasians and Compradors and the Chinese elites, okay, because you have so many Chinese there, you must have, some kind of opportunities for them, and they make money, and so usually money speaks the loudest. You can say half peak is off limit to Chinese or Eurasians, but then when you have someone like Robert Horton, yeah, what the heck, I'm going to sell the house to him because he owns a bit 3 or 4 houses over there. So no one's going to give a damn if you have enough money. So this is what happened. So yes, it started off like a colony, but this is a Chinese colony, which is different. Back in the, you can say, starting in the 16th, 17th century, when the trading posts were operating, then becoming colonies, the Chinese often would play the middleman role. So even Chinese in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, they will always also be known as very rich traders. Okay, either they were trading themselves or they will serve as a middle person for the European colonists or traders. So they were usually better off. And but in terms of Hong Kong, because it's Chinese colony, there were lots of Chinese, and so a lot of them were able to get to do well. They were successful. So that would be the picture of Hong Kong. And the following clip is a clip about some of it. I will have 2 clips of early Hong Kong. This is less, the quality is less good, but there's a bit more interviews and description about what's going on. The second one is more a better quality, but less description.
The golden wedding party of Sir Robert Ho Tung attracted Hong Kong's high society. Sir Robert, a Eurasian, began life as comprador or chief agent to Jardine Matheson. An immense fortune followed, together with 4 houses on the Peak.
I had so many compradors in my family. They were sitting on top of the world. The Eurasians have the advantage of a better command of English, and therefore they were normally chosen as compradors. And being compradors, you have great opportunities of making millions of dollars.
Foreign merchant houses, banks and institutions all needed compradors to act as their agent, negotiator and chief of Chinese staff.
My father was a prominent member of society. He was a banker. He was a comprador. And there was a lot of entertainment. It was a family that was quite close, despite the fact that there were 12 of us.
And our house was so big that the lawn was so large that we used to fly kites there, ride our bikes on it. We had a Chinese drawing room, which was of all Chinese furniture, including opium diamonds and so on, and a Western European style drawing room. But I do remember that we were always included in all the dinners and all the teas, and they were always done on a very big scale.
Hong Kong continued to see administrative and economic development in the early 20th century, but the aftermath of the First World War brought many changes. Britain no longer had a virtual monopoly of the Far Eastern trade. While Europe was suffering from unemployment and high taxation, Hong Kong's establishment enjoyed an Indian summer. In spite of the heat, ceremonial parades continued for visiting dignitaries. In China, revolution had overthrown the last Manchu emperor. The morality of imperialism was subject to question.
Colonial atmosphere was very heavy in Hong Kong. They were, the separate English was way up, and everybody was looked out on Chinese people. And the Chinese, at that time, the Chinese people actually do not find Hong Kong, they do not seem to belong to Hong Kong. They came to Hong Kong to do business, and then they went back to China. Everybody had a home in China.
The time was ripe for modern facilities attuned to Chinese business culture. The Bank of East Asia was founded by a group of highly educated young Chinese men, one of whom was Li Jiefeng.
Well, my grandfather told me that when he was a young man, he experienced difficulty in getting bank loans or bank financing when he started his business as a trader and also a ship owner. And he, together with a group of friends, decided to form this bank. The mission is not only to make money, but the mission is to throw off basically foreign dominance in the financial and economic field in Hong Kong.
The 20s saw the first signs of political and industrial tension. Strikes and boycotts inspired by the new revolutionaries in China brought Hong Kong to its knees. At the last moment, the boycott was called off and the port of Hong Kong was saved.
It was a trading post of considerable importance. But at the same time, life was very insular. It was not international to the extent of Shanghai.
Positioned at the mouth of the Yangtze River, Shanghai was the gateway to central China. Like Hong Kong, it had developed under foreign domination, but it had grown into a modern international city with an intriguing blend of East and West. It was a favorite destination for Hong Kong society.
Restaurants and cafes are crowded, and dancing to modern band music is the favorite pastime of Shanghai's cafe society.
Shanghai was the big city. It was the capital, as it were. Hong Kong was very much of a provincial town, small provincial town. I've often compared the two to Shanghai being London and Hong Kong being more like Hastings or Eastbourne at most.
The businessmen in Hong Kong did most of their business in the morning, dictated their letters, and then they went off to the Hong Kong Club and had several gin and tonics, more than several sometimes, and afterwards they'd lie in long deck chairs or rattan chairs on the veranda, sleep it off, and go back in the afternoon and sign all their letters. And I think that was their day's work.
We had a very, very nice bungalow at North Point, which was country in those days, and a lovely sandy beach all along, and mat sheds if you wanted to go swimming. And then we had this priceless donkey, and we used to ride the donkey on the main road, much to the, I suppose, the anger or, I suppose, amusement of the tram drivers. They used to stamp their feet on the bell for the donkey to get out of the way.
Well, this is the 20s, so you expect life must be pretty good for not only the Americans but also Hong Kongers. And the video also mentioned Shanghai, which I do want to mention as kind of a tale of two cities because they kind of became British colonies, or I can't say British colony. Hong Kong was a British colony, but Shanghai was a trading port open to the Western countries. They kind of, you can say, westernized or open to Western countries at the same time. But as mentioned, Shanghai was already a mid-sized city by the time the British and the other foreigners went in there to start doing business. And Shanghai had the advantage of being kind of in the center, at the mouth of the Yangtze River, so in the kind of center, at least in terms of the approximation to the capital, Beijing, compared to Canton and Hong Kong, which are in the far south. So what happened is that it was very convenient to ship goods to Shanghai. As mentioned, the Zhoushan was a serious contender to Hong Kong at one point, if not for the concern of the British of China's ability to fight back and to cost them a high price to pay militarily. But later, as they opened up ports, they find that China was actually not a serious threat, even though China engaged in a very fast, active campaign in modernizing it, purchasing modernized weapons, steam engines, and so on. But because of a very stagnant, very long time, can say Confucius mindset and the ways of doing things, they weren't modernizing very quickly or westernizing, unlike a country like Japan. So what happened is that very soon, Shanghai turns out to be a very good trading port for the Western countries. And just within a few years, they already, from changing in the past, they were 95% for all goods for Britain were shipped from Canton, and 12.5 only from Shanghai. But very soon, by within a few years, they were jumped up by a lot already. So basically, a lot of the business activities, trading activities are moving from Canton to Shanghai because it was so convenient. And there's another reason is that you can say Hong Kong was pretty free as well. Why didn't Hong Kong get as much as the business? The proximity is one issue. The position of Hong Kong as in the far south was one issue. The second one was that you can say the Shanghai trading port was an international port, meaning that it's not only the British who got there. In the beginning, you have a American concession, English concession, you have French concession in the south, and the Chinese city right over here. The concession is kind of like an extended embassy. That means that within this area, it's mostly under British control. Now, it's not exactly like it can be effectively totally British control because it's a huge area. Kind of compared to just an embassy. So it's a big area. And so in order to effectively, unless you send a lot of people over there, but on the other hand, it's also kind of because it's still within the Shanghai where you kind of you still have Chinese populations or areas lining different places. So China was always kind of mixed, okay? So, but on paper at least, or in terms of a final decision, this is international settlement. That means that when something is happening, like the final decision, which law do you abide to, you'll be judging according to, say, international laws over here. British laws, American laws, or French rules over here. So, but it's always kind of a negotiation. So you don't see, okay, F1 is British or because there are lots of Chinese. So, for example, the Chinese commit a crime, it may be caught within the concession by a a chain or a Republican, government police. But what it means is that they have to work with the foreigners, okay, to see whether this is okay a foreign subject or whether in this case does it apply for Chinese subject. If they commit this crime, can they be charged? Can they be extradited, to another area to be tried. So it kind of like that. So it became a pretty much a crime invest area or a kind of lawlessness going on. It's not that they kept breaking the laws. It's just a view, for example, did something wrong in one place, you could go to another concession and say that I have immunity. And many of the criminals, Chinese criminals, actually often take advantage of that. And one of the frequent things that they would do is that they would commit a crime, then would went to the French embassy, went into a church and say, I'm a Catholic, I want this would be a sanctuary for me, okay? So the Chinese could not enter into to arrest me. And the French would say, okay, this guy is a Catholic, so he should be protected. So you guys cannot come. For them, it's more like maintaining some kind of control. They don't want Chinese to be coming in to just grabbing anyone. But over time, it became a very serious problem with many of these in China's Guojiawan, the cases of the religion. So it appears that the foreign missionaries or the priests, often will be protecting some criminal elements in China, in Shanghai, and that really gave them a really bad reputation. So, but that would be kind of situation. Yes, even though there will be concessions and later also Japanese concessions, but most of the population will be Chinese, okay, because they like Hong Kong, they'd be operated by Chinese workers. So 99% of the Chinese residents, okay, will be outside, of these enclaves, these concessions, okay, but you'll be surrounded by these Chinese people there, and they'll go in there to work, and so it still rely on them to operate. But because they're concessions, they also try to establish some laws so that it's different. So they want to make the foreigners feel good, because if you're in the concession, don't worry, if you break any laws, you'll be going under the charge, for example, or being examined using the international laws, not the Chinese laws, which gave the foreigners, especially the merchants, the soldiers, the workers, a great comfort and security. And of course, famous stories happen in those areas that they would discriminate Chinese, and one of the most famous story would be the park in Shanghai that say no dogs in Chinese allowed. Now let's look at this clip in The Fist of Fury by Bruce Lee before I talk a little bit more about this story.
No, not allowed, I'm afraid.
And that?
You're the wrong color, so beat it.
Hey, you. Come here. You were wanting to get in here. No. Tell you what. There's only one thing you need to do. Pretend you're a dog, and I'll take you in.
Yeah!
This, of course, is a famous scene. They're all played by Hong Kong people, by the way, including the Sikh god. Also the so-called Japanese, the one Bruce Lee to become a little dog. He was one of the I don't know how exactly to say in English. He was a how do you say this? Fellow apprentice, I think, probably the best way to say it. Fellow apprentice of Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung, Yuen Wah. So they learned to do Peking opera together at a young age. So, but anyway, so I think modern research, they always question the validity of this park and the sign. Most likely, they were banning Chinese to go in, which is not news, to have some places, not including the Chinese. But it could also be that sometimes the Chinese were working for the foreigners and to bring in the dogs. So they could be the Chinese and the dogs, who will be walking the dogs of the foreigners cannot go in because the park will not allow dogs. So there's also some question about how true that rumor was. But anyway, this is a famous scene in Fist of Fury. But definitely, the Chinese were not, just like in Hong Kong, their privileges given to the foreigners, especially in the concessions area. But the fact that there will be lots of Chinese operating there and some Chinese making lots of money, enjoying time there must be true as well, because we also know lots of Chinese who are doing really well in Shanghai. And the place area that a lot of this activity is going on is called the Bund, this Waitan, which is along the Huangpu River. Nowadays, this side will be the Pudong, the east side of the Huangpu River, where the new buildings were. This old side is a Bund where you can still see a number of old buildings here. You can, and we do have a very nice clip that shows the street of Shanghai. We believe is a kind of a remastered clip, and it looks pretty authentic. And it is an old, footage of the road of Shanghai when they turn on to the Bund. So I'm just going to show you a very short one. So it's most like 1930s because the Bank of China building next to the Fairmont Place, which is this place with the green copper roof. So be right over here, as you can see nowadays, was not there yet. So it must be 1930s. Now, so Shanghai was very big city, as mentioned in the video, more like a capital because not only was it closer to the center of China, it was also benefit by the fact that it was international. So a lot of people that going to Shanghai to work, and Shanghai was really open, letting the foreigners to trade there, to invest there. So it was a very vibrant place, and also it got a earlier start at Hong Kong. So this is Wing On department stores. Later they will move to Hong Kong when China turned red, and they have the Good Companion magazine, which always showcase the modern women. A lot of these magazines will feature women, in sportswear and all, quite revealing dresses, that more westernized dresses that they weren't popular or allowed basically in China earlier. And I remember there's often this articles about this. The magazines often feature women going to places. For example, a women traveler going to America or the UK, to show that the women now, they are breaking free. They are more freedom. They can do sports unlike before when they had bound feet and they could hardly move around. Okay, and there will be missionaries to start schools for the ladies. Nanjing will have the famous school, for the women, for the girls, and so the whole kinds of new ideas happen in Shanghai. So really ahead of any other Chinese cities, including Hong Kong. And they also have film industries, which this part will be important in the future. So all of the major film companies all started in Shanghai. Later, some of it, for example, the Tenyi, for example, by Shaw Brothers, they would move their production to Hong Kong, Singapore, for different reasons, often for safety reasons or for convenience reasons or for the production of, for example, Cantonese speaking movies when there was sound. I'm not going to go in details into this history of Chinese films, but just saying that Shanghai will be the major production. And at that time, one of the kind of first generation of film, you can say movie stars, okay, including of course the most famous one would be Ran Yu. Also in the cover picture, which so they make movies like The Goddess, New Women, Playthings, Sports Queen. They all make in the 30s. Tragic figures. Eventually, she would commit suicide. Many of the early Chinese movie stars would be, because they also came across something called press, and oftentimes they were too young or too inexperienced to face that kind of pressure. On one hand, they became very famous. On the other, they became totally the object of being criticized, or where rumors began, of their personal life and a lot of the things. So a lot of them couldn't face it. There are also a lot of nightclubs. If you watch those early movies, for example, you see a lot of people partying, as you saw earlier in the clip. One person that would know it really well would be a professional Hong Kong musician, which I personally know, and currently in Vancouver. I did a recording of his days when he was forming the band in Hong Kong in the 1950s, which I'm going to talk to you about in the 1960s and early 70s, which I'm going to talk to you about and show you the clip. And his father was a famous musician called the King of Flutes, because he was very good with the flutes, and he was a Long Ping, and he was a Filipino musician. So just long story short, he was recruited, and because Filipinos are very good at playing music, so he was recruited to work in Shanghai beginning. So he said that this big Shanghai nightclub would have a huge floor, okay? We have, for example, 100 dancing girls. So if guys would go there and have fun, they can drink and they can, have parties, have some fun with the dancing girls. And he called his dad, because his dad was good looking and he was a band leader, and he, he used the word "go guy" describe his dad, which translating in English means the asshole, because his dad, he said he was, really having fun there, and he fathered, I think, a couple children in those days in Shanghai. It's only when China turning red that they moved from Shanghai to Hong Kong, and then he started his musician life in Hong Kong, which his children followed. Now, this is long story short. I'm going to talk more about, so when we talk about after the Hong Kong riot, I'm going to come back to his story, and I'm going to show you his clip, because I make it specific that I'm just fascinated by his family stories. I make him sit down and record his testimony, or you can say story, family story for me. But anyway, next I'm going to show you another clip of Hong Kong, which showed Hong Kong in the 30s, okay? So when this one is colorized, so even better, and the quality is better, so you can kind of see Hong Kong was pretty nice place, okay? Before, you can say, Japan invade China, but because unlike China, which went through a lot of hardship and fighting, remember after the Qing government fell, there are lots of warlords coming up, so Chiang Kai-shek, the Sun Yat-sen's protege, came up from the south, all the way from Guangzhou, the Guangdong province, fighting his way to unify. But then when Japan saw that China is unifying, and it's probably harder to manipulate, they start occupying places in China, including Manchuria. Then eventually in 1937 start invading China. So China, and in between that, China also saw kind of like infighting between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek against the communists, the rising communists, under Mao Zedong and Zhu De and those people. So China saw a lot of conflicts. Hong Kong relatively, peaceful, even though it was never as kind of developed or as popular as Shanghai in those days, at least before, all the way up to the war. But Hong Kong was pretty good. Hong Kong was pretty decent and a favorite spot for many people. So this is a slightly longer clip, but it shows a lot of great clips of Hong Kong, what Hong Kong looks like in the 1930s.
From the ferries which serve the island can be had a splendid vista of the city, built upon the sloping rocky sides of the celebrated peak. The city's name is Victoria, in honor of England's great queen. Hong Kong, the name of the island upon which it stands. Under tolerant and wise British rule, with willing Oriental assistance, has grown a modern Western city in an Eastern setting, where more than 1 million contented Chinese dwell in harmony, merging their ancient civilization, culture, and manners with those of the 20,000 Europeans who guide or minister to them. Standing in solitary simplicity is the impressive cenotaph, memorial to Britain's World War dead. And nearby, the Chinese fallen are revered in similar dignity. Near the center of the city is the Supreme Court building, symbol of justice to all creeds and races. The imposing 17-story air-conditioned Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank stands out in architectural beauty, even among the many other splendid buildings of which the city is justly proud. Arcaded sidewalks afford ample protection against rain or sun. The modern Chinese women dress in form-fitting garments of conventional design. Because Victoria is literally built upon the side of a hill, sedan chairs as a mode of transportation are used extensively, affording a comfortable and convenient means of reaching the various levels. The most popular residential sites are those situated on the verdant slopes overlooking the city. Tier upon tier, the well-kept gardens and beautiful homes rise into the cooler atmosphere of the peak. To reach the various levels requires but a few minutes by the electric cable tram, or not many more in a motor car over well-paved roads. The peak cable tram travels to the top station, 1,300 feet above the sea, in 7 minutes, and inhabitants of the colony call this gliding climb a shortcut to fairyland. From the top station, a further ascent of another 500 feet by sedan chair or afoot is rewarded by a superb marine panorama, seldom equaled and never surpassed. In the foreground is the beautiful natural harbor, where the large liners and men of war look like toy ships in a child's bath. And in the distance, the hills of Kowloon and the mountains of China. Below, the great city of this proud crown colony is spread out map-like along the shores. In the opposite direction can be seen the hills and valleys, bays and inlets of the southern coast. On the south shore, protected from storms and winds, is Repulse Bay, the most popular bathing beach of Hong Kong. On the broad white sands are grass beach houses, and bathers loll in the late afternoon sun or swim in the safe, crystal clear waters of the bay. A modern touch is added by the Lido, a large pavilion containing bathhouses and recreation facilities. And on its terraces, guests may dine and dance, or just enjoy cooling drinks while looking out upon tranquil scenes. Junks, scores of junks, picturesque traders of the China seas from time immemorial, and perennial homes of countless thousands upon thousands of hardy waterfolk, whose livelihood and heritage is on the seas and rivers they serve. Every day, fleets of picturesque junks find shelter and safety in the friendly harbors of Hong Kong, Britain's pride of the East, and for nearly 100 years, the greatest trading center of and gateway to South China.
Okay, it's a pretty British colonial perspective, but I'm still thankful for the footage because we get to see a lot of Hong Kong in those days, and the people in the 30s and the buildings, and the harbor looked actually pretty big, okay, compared to today, because all the reclaimed land, now the harbor was quite a bit narrower because of all this reclaimed land on both sides. But back then, you can kind of still see the original shape of Kowloon. Now, next, I'm going to really speak through the wartime. I decide not to spend too long on it because I can just keep going with all the war stories. But just to make a long story short, Japan's ambition on China had been around for a long time. And as mentioned, as China getting to be unified again after the kind of long time of being you can say bullied or being oppressed by the foreign forces in the 1920s, Japan decided, especially the army in this area, the Kwantung Army, decided to take things in their manner. So they got an excuse saying there's Chinese trying to sabotage the railroad that managed by Japanese, the South Manchurian Railroad. So they decided to take the initiative and preemptive strike and took over this huge area, the ancient homeland of the Manchus, Manchuria, and call it Manchu Guo, saying that we're not occupying it, but we are asking a Manchu king to rule again, so it became independent from China. Well, which of course is just taking a page from the book of annexing this place, or creating a new country, new state that's friendly or actually controlled by Japan, but claiming that it's not Japan taking the place. So everyone knew. So Japan was trying to, take advantage of this and not. I don't think when the war broke out in 1937, Japan was trying to invade the whole of China, because from the things happening later in terms of whether Japan wants to talk or whether Japan's preparedness for the war was quite obvious that Japan was not prepared for whole-scale invasion or occupation of China, not only because of its own limitation, but also because China at that time, you have, for example, foreign forces in different places and foreign interests. And Japan was not ready to clash with those nations yet. But what happened is like a skirmish between Japan and China in Peking, and somewhere close to Peking in Marco Polo Bridge, where Japan say there's a soldier missing and they need to search for him, which likely to be true. And then later the soldier returned, but in the process, when the Chinese troops refused, they start exchanging, first curses and then bullets, gunshots, and then eventually escalate. By that time, Japan was so proud and so full of themselves and so believing in their invincibility against China, that any kind of resistance of China was not tolerated. So what happened is that when China shouted back and refused, they start firing and shelling, and then eventually occupy Beijing and then Tianjin. But every time Japan would stop, kind of ask China to come to the table. Now, China was in a very difficult situation because the leader, Chiang Kai-shek, not only he earlier was forced to stop his pursuit of the communists and decide to fight against Japan, but also because Japan already took the whole area without basically fighting the Chinese. And so he was already, many people questioned his loyalty and patriotism. And his likely reason of not contesting Manchuria is that because he believed that he was not ready, China was not ready to fight against Japan yet. But if China did not make a stand now when they occupying the old capital and keep going down, Chiang Kai-shek had no more excuses. So Chiang Kai-shek refused to talk to Japan, but rather kept fighting. And they picked the big battlefield in Shanghai. And Shanghai, not only because of its kind of political and commercial significance, also because Shanghai also continued to have the international concessions. So the foreigners are still there. Meaning that foreigners were still there, the Japanese could not do a whole-scale or effective invasion of it, the usual, carpet bombing and then, cutting it off and then occupying. So Japan could not. Japan had to skip all these places that's under the Western countries' control. So they still bomb, indiscriminately. This is a famous picture of the Shanghai station. When this boy, the Japanese still claim that they staged. Now the picture is kind of staged because he wasn't just alone here. He was with his young elder brother, who was just maybe 2 or 3 years older than him. He was a toddler. With him, they both lost their parent of their mom because of the bombing. So he was an actual orphan, but he wasn't sitting right at the edge. Okay, so they kind of staged the kind of scene, okay, with the destruction in the background, but it wasn't a fabricated story. It was a real picture of destruction, of this discriminate bombing, and a real victim here. It's just that he was put closer to the track without his slightly older brother. But it was happening, and this cartoon showed that the different nationals were watching this unfolding and kind of watching like the Olympics at that time it's the Munich Olympics. They're kind of watching the Olympics with the two, Japanese and the the Republican armies fighting against one another. As a result, China, also because of Chiang Kai-shek pulling in his elite forces in Shanghai to fight, as they last for 3 months, which was a miraculous, at least in terms of the early happening, because Beijing and Tianjin fell really quickly. So Japanese were saying that, okay, within 3 months, we're going to finish up China, okay? Shanghai, maybe a couple of weeks or so on, then we're going to go down. So Japan was threatening China, saying, if you don't surrender or if you don't negotiate a peace treaty, well, I'm going to keep going down. In 3 months, you'll be gone, okay? So, but there's still no strong evidence of Japan was still thinking about, was confident about their ability. Now, they're confident about their military ability, but they weren't confident about the diplomatic situation because they knew that the foreign countries would not allow that. So they're just trying to force China to come to the table. But when China refused, when Chiang Kai-shek refused, later on, they went to Nanking and launched a massive massacre and mass rape, and so which was famously known as the Nanking rape of Nanking, to basically force China to ban, because at that time Nanking was the new capital of the nationalists. So what happened is that when Chiang Kai-shek still refused after the fall of Nanking, he just moved the capital to Chongqing inland and continued to fight. Japan had no option. He had to continue to fight because the only option was to back down, okay, to leave. But at that time, they were so proud and they're so arrogant, they refused. They thought, okay, I'm just going to bomb, I'm just going to go in. Chongqing is over here, okay. Now it's pronounced Chongqing, okay. And so after Japan occupy Beijing, Tianjin, and go all the way down to defeat Shanghai and then defeat Nanjing, they kept going in, they're already kind of infringing on the areas of control of Britain. So they're already arguing, and the states already cutting off resources of Japan, for example, scrap metal and oil embargo. But Japan would not go down to area, for example, Hong Kong, Macau, still, because they were still in the hands of foreigners. So when did Japan actually did it? Japan finally did it when it got no option, because when the battlefield keep extending, Japan find that they actually straining their resources because they never intend China would be that stubborn. They expect China to surrender, but when China refuses to surrender, they need to keep all this occupied area, and keeping the supply lines and reinforcement lines open. So they couldn't just leave and focus on going into Chongqing. And so they have to secure this area. That means there's a huge area that they need to control, and with limited resources and human power, so they're stretched, especially with materials, because as mentioned, the Western countries start, limiting the Western power. Of course, they the trouble as well because they're fighting Germany, for example, the British and the French. But Americans were still isolated, and the Americans saying, "No, I'm not involving, but I'm going to cut you off from the oil and from the scrap metal, so that to limit their way to make battle, to make war." So Japan was stuck. They couldn't go up because they tried briefly, but beaten back by the Soviets and Mongolia because the Soviets actually lost a battle in early 20th century, the Russo-Japanese War. So they lost to Japan. So they were very wary that Japanese would invade their territories. So the Russians were ready when Japan tried to go up. So the only way to go was south. But the problem with the south was that if you go down to Southeast Asia to get the plentiful resources, even though the resources were plentiful, you're going into Western powers area. For example, if you go down to Hong Kong, it'll be British, Macau will be Portuguese, the Philippines will be under American control, and go all the way down Malaysia, Burma, Singapore under British rule. Go down to Indonesia with Dutch. So it means that if you go down the south to get Southeast Asia, you are declaring war on all this Western power. But they have no choice because they're stretched, and they would not allow their face to take that, slapping by retreating, saying that they cannot finish off China. So they want to continue the war to battle on while China's still refusing to surrender. So what happened is that they decided to go down, but before they went down, they need to solve a biggest problem, which is the biggest power presence in Southeast Asia, which was the United States. And the United States already knew Japan may be up to something not good. So they already moved their naval base from the coast, from the west coast to Honolulu, to Hawaii, just to be closer to Asia. So Japan in order to go down to the Southeast Asia, they need to solve the problem of the American military presence. So they developed this plan, hoping that to launch a surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor naval base, the U.S. naval base, and destroy its warships as well as with aircraft carrier. They would be able to delay the Americans from rearming. So their best hope was that if we destroy enough, it would take the Americans maybe a year or so to rearm. By that time, we got all the resources from Southeast Asia we wanted. We conclude the war in China. So there's no reason to fight on. So we'll at that time negotiate with the states, okay, and maybe appease them, ask them there's no point of fighting. So if all according to the plan. So what happened is that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And then you can kind of see it was definitely an orchestra attack. They still claim that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not supposed to be a surprise because in the kind of Chinese terms or the kanji Japanese term, surprise attack means kind of sneaky and hidden or a not very glamorous surprise attack. So the Japanese was not willing to admit that, but it was every bit a surprise attack because they're supposed to declare war on America, half an hour before they start attacking. But the point is they start sending ships out and aircraft areas over to approach Hawaii as early as November, half a month ago, at least 2 weeks ago. So basically, it's very much a orchestra surprise attack on Hawaii. At the end, that message came late, so they blamed the delay in the message, so it became a surprise attack. But essentially, it was a surprise attack. And you can kind of see, as soon as they attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked all the other major military presence of the Western power, for example, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Philippines, all within. Philippines probably they worked out the time wrong, but MacArthur there at that time did not respond quickly. So what happened is that they went in there, attacked on the military facilities, the airstrip and everything to stop the British Americans from waging an air war against Japan. So after they eliminate all this, for example, Hong Kong, they bombed the Kai-Tak airport, destroyed it basically, and then they sent in the ground troops. And this is the two comparison between British Singapore and British Hong Kong, and both within days, they destroyed Hong Kong's defense. And in Hong Kong, there's something closer to home. It's not because not just the British soldiers were there, the UK soldiers were there. The UK soldiers include Australians and Canadians, and many of them experienced hardship and horror at the hands of the Japanese invaders. One of them is the most horrible stories would be in Stanley, where there would be a school. Back then it was a hospital, military base there. And so when the Japanese went down there, it was where a lot of the Canadians were defending. According to later documentary, the Canadians sent there did not even know what they were fighting against. So they were sent there just because the British were running out of troops. So they sent the Canadians there. They didn't think that, the Japanese may not come, so just stationed there, but they were under-equipped, under-trained. And when the Japanese came, they overrun the whole city within days. They attacked, and they lots of rumors, one of them that I keep repeating, I believe, it's probably has some truth to it because I heard it many times. He said the British officers at the beginning thought that the Japanese would not attack at nighttime because the Japanese eyes are too small, so they wouldn't be able to see too well. But of course, that's not true. But then, according to the Canadian soldiers, I remember one very vividly. Later on, I'll find it, but I haven't got a chance to show that long documentary or the clip to the students yet. So what happened is they talk about as a young Canadian soldier, he was wounded in the war, and he went into this Stanley military hospital. And this Canadian nurse was very kind to him because he was just a kid. And she asked him what he needed. He said, I want hot chocolate. And she said, we can get you some. So he was helping him recover. When the Japanese came, one of the things that they did was went into the hospital and kill all the sick people on the bed because they didn't want any sick soldiers there to use up the food and the medical supplies. So they killed them all. And in this case, they also unleashed their animal, horror on beastly behavior on the nurses. They raped a few of the foreign nurses, including the British nurses as well as the Canadian nurse that soldier remember, and after raping them, killing them. So I remember watching that documentary, and he was recounting the stories, and he still had tears, when he recounted that, how that kind Canadian nurse was treating him. And it was many years, he recounted stories, I think, about 30 years later in the 70s. It happened in the 40s, and he still remember, and he was still visibly shaken when he talked about that story. But lots of horrors like that, the Japanese oftentimes, in the beginning days, first 2 or 3 days, the command allowed them to, to attack on the civilians, not only to attacking them, having horror on them, and oftentimes it's sexual crimes on the women, just like what they did in Nanjing. Nanjing is more orchestra because they want to bring the nationalist government to their knees by, ravaging the capital. But Hong Kong is just, which happened to many cities, in the first 1 or 2 nights, they allow the soldiers to do that to get this out of the system, and to terrorize the city so that no one would be thinking about resisting, and then they would send in orders to stop them. So Japanese are usually very good when they have an actual order. So definitely it was something to do with the high command. So it's not something that they didn't know. For example, take an example in Nanjing, when all this raping is happening, they never step into for example, the area where some foreigners, including one famous story of a Nazi official in Nanjing, he was able to protect some of the Chinese there, the refugees there, because he he was able to, because when he fly the Nazi flag, and the Japanese commander asked the soldiers not to go in there. So, and also another is a Jining Women's University where the principal was able to protect some of the girls and also refugees within the campus because of her American background. So it was before, of course, it was before Pearl Harbor, before Japan launching attack on America. So it was in 1938. So she was able to protect. So understood that. So Japanese soldiers could be stopped, but the fact that they weren't stopped is because the higher leadership allowed them to do that. So Hong Kong, to summarize the war experience, Hong Kong fell in the Christmas of 1941, and it experienced 3 years and 8 months of occupation by Japan. Hong Kong really suffered, but it was not a focus of the Japanese army. Hong Kong really suffered because they need the resources of Hong Kong. So they took down things. For example, they took down some of the bronze statues, including the Queen Victoria statue in Central, and confiscated, so that they plan to eventually melt it and turn into, to make bullets out of it. But eventually, because they were defeated, very soon, so they never used it. So the UK was able to reclaim that statue now in Queen Elizabeth Park, where the statue is still there. But what happened is that Hong Kong people experienced really big hardship because the Japanese was basically draining the resources of Hong Kong to feed its war machine, because the goal was not Hong Kong. The goal was to defeat the British so that the British would not be able to pose some resistance to their going down to Southeast Asia to get all the resources to continue the war. So the goal was to go to, for example, get the rubber of Malaysia, to go to get the oil in Southeast Asia, to other raw materials, things like that. So it's not to go to get Hong Kong. Hong Kong was more like to make sure that the British presence there was not going to pose any problem. So oftentimes a lot of hardship, lots of people share personal losses. I have personal losses. Two of my biological grandparents died during the wartime. One of them died because of a shelling. She got hit, not directly, but then it's an infection. Then she died in hospital. And then my grandfather, according to my aunts and uncles, he was a spy because they used to have a Morse code machine upstairs, and they could, at least my mom's sister, remember, if you remember right, the father would go up to the attic and then or upstairs somewhere and start typing, okay, and she would hear the Morse code machine there. So, but the truth is that he was arrested by Japanese and never to be found again. So likely he was really implicated, or he was arrested for that. But we don't know. We never got any proof. They were too young to find out what happened to their father, and then the relatives sent them away and to the countryside to escape. And so my mom was too young at that point, and so she, as the youngest, she didn't know what happened to her father. So, but that's personal. And later nowadays, if you go to Hong Kong History Museum, you can still see some of the other, the kind of this one is the signs of at that time they took over the Peninsula Hotel in Tsim Sha Tsui. Nowadays, if you go there, it's one of the most high-end hotels in Hong Kong for a long time. Probably not now, but back then, the Peninsula Hotel was famous to have many Rolls Royce, okay, as rides, okay. So if you arrive at the airport, because it's so expensive, you can ask them to send a Rolls Royce to pick you up from the airport and send you to the hotel. And so because it was like a Western building, very grand, so the Japanese use it as the headquarters. So this is the side, the back, outside of the headquarters of the Japanese occupation forces. And then you have the other, for example, some of the names of the POWs, the list of the POWs, and throughout the Japanese occupied area, also all the POWs were mistreated, including the British. Already they didn't kill them all, which is already a kind of, I think it's kind of a reassurance, okay, just in case, okay, in the future they may have exchanged the POW, so they allowed them to survive. But you can kind of see the conditions are really bad because Japanese are notorious to mistreat the POWs. What their ideal is that if you lose, okay, you should die on the battlefield. That's hero. And if you don't die in fighting, at least you should commit suicide. For example, just like what the kamikaze is doing, crashing their planes onto their enemy's ships, okay? So for those who would surrender, they look down on that, especially if they're foreigners, okay? Non-Japanese, and some other races probably they will already die. But they're British and they will be kept there. Many of them die, of course. And they were kept. Eventually, Japan was defeated and they were released. But the Japanese did not offer a apology until many years later. So many years later, meaning let me work out, more than 50 years later, they issued an apology in 2011. And many of the Canadians, Canadian veterans were very unhappy. For example, this one said there may be only 30 of us left. All the rest die on the battlefield. They die of starvation in Japanese camps, or they died since that happened. The Japanese have been denying what happened in Southeast Asia for 70 years now. So another one said, I don't accept the apology. A veteran said that the people who inflicted so much suffering on him and his fellow prisoners were the ones who should have offered an apology at that time. Instead, they left it for another generation of Japanese far removed from the war. So now the Japanese mentality is another topic. They refuse to accept responsibility often. They will often call the whole thing as a tragedy, and they try to claim that they're victims themselves. For example, they were hit by an atomic bomb, but oftentimes they refuse responsibility and reject some of the numbers. For example, how many people die in Nanjing, how many people raped in Nanjing. Also, for example, they refuse the fact that they imprison, they kidnap girls to make them turn them into prostitutes, to comfort women, and so they continue nowadays. There's a lot of war hurts or memories going on, and anger in the neighboring countries against Japan. So that continue. Now, to conclude today's class, I just want to say, what happened when Japan surrendered in 1945, which is an interesting and will lead nicely to our next discussion, was that Japan surrendered, somehow there was typo, in 1945, okay, I'll change it before I post the PowerPoint. Despite the nationalists had a sizable army groups, about 60,000 very close to Hong Kong, because at that time, the base of the KMT, the nationalists, was in the south, in Guangdong province. But 60,000 were there. Chiang Kai-shek decided not to send troops to reclaim Hong Kong because he thought that Hong Kong could wait, because no one else wanted Hong Kong, and he was very focused into occupying major cities and major network railroads in China, because it's like a scramble. As soon as Japan surrendered, they scrambled because the communists had grown to a certain size as well during the war, oftentimes avoiding major battles. So mostly it was fought between the nationalist government and the Japanese armies, and with the American helping China. But the communists would engage often in guerrilla fighting, but also avoiding major campaigns to reserve resources and power, which they did nicely. But what important is that they would be scrambling for resources because they already knew, for example, for the area liberated by the Soviets, for example, Manchuria, the resources would likely go to the communists, which they did. And so the nationalists would only get the resources when it's claimed by, for example, Western armies. So they were scrambling. Hong Kong was not important. So Chiang Kai-shek didn't even bother to send, say, 2,000 people to claim Hong Kong. And Mao Zedong didn't realize either. So later on, he would say that I never recognized British claim on Hong Kong. So the communist stand nowadays, especially now, is kind of strange because they say that we never accept because we're not Qing government. So as a government or a regime, we never recognized Hong Kong was part of Britain. And so they never recognized British has sovereignty over China, over Hong Kong, but just administrative, presence over Hong Kong. So that creates some strange revisionist history or rereading of the history because Hong Kong was, under British rule, right? It's just you not recognizing, and so that gives them, kind of some kind of rhetorical, claim over Hong Kong, but in reality, it was in the hands of British. And Mao later also admitted that the CCP actually was not interested in Hong Kong at that point because also they were trying to fight against the nationalists, the KMT, and try to seize as much arms and area and soldiers as possible to start their civil war, which they did right after the Japan surrender. And the Americans also had a very strange change of mind because Americans were in the beginning favor of the former colonies gaining independence because Americans never had that extent of colonies like the British Empire. British Empire, some of the old schools, including Winston Churchill, was kind of supporting Britain to continue its colonial presence. For example, in India, in other places. So Winston Churchill was against Roosevelt regarding the future world order. But Roosevelt was more into, let them gain their independence, okay? Well, this colonial, history should pass, okay? And for the Americans, they had very few colonies compared to the British. So for them, it's not a big deal. But the British was a big deal, and including the crown jewel, India, right? So, but Hong Kong was also one of them. So they were eyeing back to reclaiming Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. In terms of Malaysia and Singapore, the difficulties was that the people there lost trust in the British rule when they saw the British being beaten so badly by the Japanese. You remember, Malaysia and Singapore was a major British military presence at that time. Way more soldiers. I didn't give you the numbers back then, so I'll flash it really quickly. So just allow me to go back. In the case of Singapore, British had 6 times or close to 6 times as many troops, and there's major military bases in Singapore compared to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was just a place where they had, and also many of the soldiers were British soldiers were more Commonwealth soldiers from Australia, Canada, India, and they have more troops against the invaders. The invaders for Singapore was 36,000, but in Hong Kong they face more invaders. So Hong Kong losing for a bigger invading force against a smaller presence, it's kind of accepted, and it's not that surprising. But for Singapore to fall so easily, they really lost their trust in the British rule. But Hong Kong's kind of situation is different because Hong Kong, and also because of a transient nature, when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong, many of the people went back to China into the inland. So what happened is that when the Japanese invading China, many people went to Hong Kong. just to escape under the live under the British flag. But when the Japanese came, they went again away, back to the more inland area, for example, Guangxi, including some of my relatives. They went there. My grandfather went, my father's side, the grandfather went to India to work. So there were areas for them to leave. So some of them did not stay in Hong Kong. So what happened is that for the Hong Kong, there was less of a kind of resentment against the British not defending the city too well, because they kind of understood, there was a overwhelming Japanese force hitting at Hong Kong. And so what happened is that the British wanted to claim back Hong Kong after the war. And because the nationalists and the CCP, they were busy fighting and against one another, no one really cared enough. And the Americans also allow it to happen because Americans already sensing, especially later, the spread of communism in Asia. For example, in China, there's a communist. Then in Korea, especially, because when the Americans went to try to liberate Korea, they find that the Soviets already occupied. So the Americans actually had to tell the Soviets not to advance further from North Korea. So by that time they reached Korea, it's very clear that the Soviet would not be willing to give the whole Korea to some kind of election. So they partitioned this country. So Americans already knew, that the communist influence was spreading in Asia. So they desperately need more kind of friendly areas or areas of democracy or not democracy, or at least to freedom, or under the Western countries' control, at least not within the Soviets or the communist bloc, in order to withstand the wave of communism in Asia. So later on, that would really play advantage to Japanese because they would allow Japanese to rebound within an amazingly short time. But the idea to allow Britain to claim back Hong Kong was also part of this understanding, because at least it's in British hand. It's better than if it's in Chinese hand. And in the early days, it's still not believable to think that the communists would prevail and defeat the KMT, because KMT is about 4 times as big in terms of military presence. But still, it was a concern. So they thought that maybe having Hong Kong in British hands would be a not bad idea. That's why Hong Kong remained, unlike, for example, Singapore and Malaysia, which became independent very quickly. So that changed the fate of Hong Kong as well. But next will be another big change is that when China changed color and how it impact Hong Kong. So that will be our next discussion, the discussion of next class.